funny, but it's not. I think that should be a rule in your house. I really do. Colossians 4:6. Let your speech always be with grace. Pastor, where'd you get that title? Marriage Motivated by Grace, the Bible. God just says, impart grace to the hearers. Let your speech always be seasoned with grace, that you may know how you ought to respond to others. What's a better way to say that? What's a better way? How do I say this without causing more damage in my relationship? By the way, when it talks about don't have unwholesome words, don't cut down and rather build up, it's a real simple, I'm not a builder. Very few things that I've built are still standing today. But it's a real common statement that Jesus is making. I asked folks in China years ago when I was there, we were talking about marriage and we were talking about communication, talking about this verse, and I said, how long does it take you? It was a Lisu tribe, a minority tribe, so they were really poor, out in the middle of nowhere. They weren't ethnic Chinese, they could have as many children as they want. And so I asked them a question, how long does it take you to build a house? Which is more like a hut. And they said, well, to gather the materials, blah, 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 about 3 years. About 3 years. And it is unbelievable because they're, 600-700 square feet. About 3 years to gather the material. They don't have bank loans. Most of the world doesn't live that way. Just gather 3 years. And I said, how long would it take you to tear it down? Peter, leader of the group. What? Why would we do that? I forget why. I couldn't get through to him. I'm trying to make a point. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't tear it down. Our enemies would tear it down and said, okay. Finally, the interpreter convinced him. He's going to use this in illustration. He said, one day. Now here's the principle, folks. You can be sweet to your wife for 11 months and in one day tear it down. You can lose everything you've built up in 11 months because you simply didn't follow the Bible. You didn't close your mouth, engage your brain, and do what the Bible said you ought to do. And wives, you could do it too. You could tear your husband down too. I remember the first time I said to Alexis, you hurt my feelings. She didn't believe me. She did not believe me. We've been married about 3 years, and I said, that devastated me. And she doesn't do that very often, And she said, well, I just can't believe I've done that, and I'm glad I have never done that before. And I said, oh, well, shucks, honey. Matter of fact, I've got about a dozen of those stored up inside of me. But you know what? It's difficult for them. It doesn't sound very manly to just, honey, you hurt my feelings. It just doesn't sound very manly. But you know what? We need to do that. She had no idea that she'd ever hurt my feelings. And I hadn't told her. And it wasn't a big deal until one of them really... I'm going to tell you what happened. I was in Walmart in Montana, and this one lady said to me, my brother-in-law passed away, Pastor John, and you never called me. And I've been back 3 weeks, and you've never come to see me. And my wife said, John is sorry. Stood in front of me and said, John is sorry, blah, blah, blah. And I grabbed her by the arm, put her behind me, and I said, John is not sorry. I didn't know your brother-in-law died. I didn't know you went out of town, and I didn't know you came back. And this lady had been mad at me since the day I set foot in that state. And every little thing that I did, she was mad about. And I just felt that there was time for me to be very firm and say, I cannot help you if I don't know what's going on. But Lexus ran in there and she wanted to diffuse this. She'll cover up, the Holocaust. If I could exaggerate. And I said to her on the way home, I said, honey, that really devastated me. It doesn't sound like a big deal, and who knows, maybe it was weak. I don't know, things happen so fast. But when you do damage, you have a hard time undoing it. I don't have this on your notes, but it needs to be added. James 1:19 and 20, where James says, listen, brethren, he says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. You got to put that on your fridge, put it on your bathroom mirror. Be in a hurry to listen. And I remember going to Wyoming to a marriage conference with my wife. Interestingly enough, we had been married a couple years, and I had led a few of them, but I didn't want to go to one. Sound like a pretty typical guy. Hey, honey, let's go down. We can go to Wyoming. It's a marriage conference. We're putting it on. We can ride horses and all that. I said, I'd really just rather do nothing this weekend. Well, let's go. So I went, but I didn't want to go. The 5 languages of love. Remember those conferences? And I went, and this guy was saying stuff, and I thought, man, I know all that. And he gave me this assignment with Alexis that night. And I thought, well, we can knock this out in about 5 minutes. And then we can go have fun. What fills your love tank? Which I thought was corny. I was mad at that phrase too. A love tank? I could be watching a ball game right now, and I'm trying to find my love tank. I don't even know where it is, But it said, see if I can remember this right. Things that fill your love tank: words of affirmation, acts of service, gifts, touch, and I can't remember the 5th one, but it doesn't matter. So, what fills your wife's love tank? And I said, acts of service. Man, this is easy. Let's get this over with, and we'll get on them horses and, leave the love tanks behind, And so I said, acts of service fills my, and it's just Alexis and I. And hers was words of affirmation. She said, that's what fills my husband's love tank. And so we were supposed to do it and then share with it and then move on. We were up till midnight arguing. And she said, acts of service doesn't fill my love tank. I said, what? It fills mine, should fill yours. It fills yours. Words of affirmation fills yours. I don't know. And you know what we did? We made ourselves the standard like so many couples do. Instead of listening to each other, really listening, wanting to be there, and I should have said, I would have never guessed in a million years that words of affirmation mean so much to you. And she said, I didn't realize so much acts of service. I even said to her one day, honey, you can tell me you love me if you want to, but I just want you to clean my house. Just clean the house. That's 1,000,000 I love yous. She said, that's weird. But you know what? We've learned, and our marriage has gotten stronger. We've learned, and we've stumbled along the way. Let me give you some biblical examples of godly confrontation, so you don't think I'm making this up. Nathan and David. The way Nathan confronted David with a story. David had devastated his family, his marriage, and his nation. His sin affected other people. And folks, if you don't think your sin and your compromise don't affect other people, you're living in a fantasy world. Because you don't have to be the king of Israel to know that sin begets sin, like a domino effect. And he said, there's a story, David, and all this guy had a bunch of sheep, and he wanted more. And he took a sheep from a fellow who only had one sheep. He goes and tells the story, and David's fury burned inside of him. And he says, we've got to find that man and take care of him. Nathan said, thou art that man. You're that man, David. Israel never recovered, folks. Israel never recovered from David's compromise. His own son, Absalom, listen to me, dads. Walk in these shoes, Dad. When I think of this, it devastates me that someday Zach, Zimmer, or Zebedee would want to see me out of leadership, want to dethrone me, and want to shame me, and would try to kill me. Walk in those shoes, Dad. Absalom wanted him. And you know what? Solomon's son did the same thing, messed up the kingdom. How about the story of the prodigal son that Jesus tells us? Squanders the inheritance. I don't have to say the kind of living he had. We know, don't we?